Good evening. Thank you for joining tonight's discussion, Recognizing and Responding to Everyday Antisemitism and Islamophobia, hosted by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. This evening's conversation is being recorded. I am Heather Miller-Rubens, Executive Director and Roman Catholic Scholar here at ICJS, and I'm honored to welcome you this evening. The mission of ICJS is to dismantle religious bias and bigotry by building learning communities where religious difference becomes a powerful force for good. At ICJS, we believe that it is critical to provide everyone, everywhere, with the tools needed to respond to prejudice within our workplaces and classrooms, within our friend groups, and even within our own families. Indeed, the conversations that we have with our loved ones are oftentimes the hardest ones to have, but we need to have those conversations. At ICJS, we have committed ourselves to disrupting and challenging religious prejudice in the United States, wherever we find it, and with the tools that we have available to us. And one important tool that you have right now is your voice, your words. You may think to yourself, what can my words do? How could I change anything? But friends, you are vitally important. Don't be indifferent. Don't be silent. Indeed, silence is deadly. Susanna Heschel wrote the following about her late father, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a great 20th century Jewish leader and Holocaust survivor. Susanna writes, "Words," my father often wrote, "are themselves sacred. God's tool for creating the universe and our tools for bringing holiness or evil into the world. He used to remind us that the Holocaust did not begin with the building of the crematoria, and Hitler did not come to power with tanks and guns. It all began with uttering evil words, with defamation, with language and propaganda. Words create worlds," he used to tell me when I was a child. "They must be used very carefully." My hope for you, for each of you, is that when you leave tonight's program, you will better recognize the power of words in our everyday conversations. And in turn, I hope that you will recognize the power of your own voice in the fight against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Because it's still true today. Our words are powerful. Our words still create worlds. It's now my pleasure to hand this evening's program off to Matt Taylor, Ben Sachs, and Halla Attallah.
My name is Matt Taylor, and I'm the Protestant scholar here at ICJS, and I'll be kind of the MC facilitator participant in our time tonight. And let me introduce my colleagues here who will be helping to guide us tonight. So Halla Attallah is a PhD student at Georgetown University. In fact, we were just confirming 1 month from today, Halla will be defending her dissertation. So if you have prayers that you can send to any God, or if you have good thoughts that you can send into the universe, be doing that 1 month from today on behalf of Halla, who will be completing her PhD. And she specializes in Islam, and especially in the Quran and in topics of disability in the Quran. And then my colleague Ben Sachs is our Jewish scholar here at ICJS. Anyone who's done anything with ICJS knows Ben. He's been around for eons, and we are grateful to have him. So let me start tonight, though, with a little bit of a caveat. So we're going to be having some difficult conversations over the course of the next hour and a half. Conversations that are hard to do interreligiously, because even talking about, even bringing up anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, even if it's just in a diagnostic or responsive fashion, can lead to heightened emotions and anxiety for some and maybe even many of us. Right? Many of our participants today experience these forms of religious bias and bigotry, not in some clinical or emotionally detached way, but very personally and viscerally. So because we're going to be talking about sensitive topics, and we just want to acknowledge that from the start. And we also want to acknowledge that everyone who's here, everyone who has joined this call is doing so because we recognize that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are real problems in our world, are real problems in our society that need to be addressed, and we're all here to learn and grow. So it is possible that Ben or Halla or I, or maybe one of the people in your breakout room, will say something that feels offensive, that feels like it crosses a line. And part of the purpose of tonight is that we want to be able to grow comfortable in highlighting that, in pointing that out. So let's assume good faith of each other and recognizing that we all are carrying around elements of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia because they're kind of baked into our society, and just recognize that part of the process that even we are trying to have through this event is to be able to talk about these things, to be able to talk honestly and openly about them. So with that in mind, I want to take some time and just talk about what is the framework through which we're approaching tonight. So I'm going to throw this first question to Ben. We titled this event, Recognizing and Responding to Everyday Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So my question for you, Ben, is what do we mean by everyday anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and why did we choose to highlight that, do you think?
Thanks, Matt. And it's only been 9 years, not eons, but it's all good. So everyday anti-Semitism and everyday Islamophobia is actually quite different than the sorts of things that you see on the news. We're not going to be talking about Rothschild-inspired space lasers. We're not going to be talking about violence in certain communities. We're not going to be talking about graffiti. What we're going to be talking about is the problematic nature of the culture that we currently live in, that by, not by its nature, but by its architecture, builds in certain biases against Muslims, against Jews, against African Americans, against women. This is all basic to most of you in this room, that we have these problems in society that make their way out just in everyday interactions in language. And so everyday anti-Semitism and everyday Islamophobia could be misunderstood as something that you take offense to, that you might hear something and you'll say, that doesn't sound right, or something is addressed to you and that doesn't feel right. But the point that we want to drive home this evening is that, like what Heather was quoting earlier, these words have power and force. And because we're contained by our culture and the words that we use, we're all trying our best not to be violent in this language. That one of the dangers of everyday anti-Semitism and everyday Islamophobia is that maybe for you and perpetrator is a strong word, but those who may not have intended to offend realize that isn't necessarily received as offense, but a fear of one's safety. That it's not simply heard by the person that is, quote, being offended, but rather that person feels unsafe. And what does that mean, unsafe? It's not uncomfortable. It's not disoriented. It has to do with physical safety. There are realities in that person's life. There are narratives that make up that person's experience, that when those words hit them and land on them, you have to recognize that there's a feeling of being unsafe. And the other thing that we want to recognize in the everyday life, in our everyday language, is that all of us are guilty of it. So one of the problems when we say we are fighting anti-Semitism or Islamophobia is that we project our fight outwards. It becomes an us and them type of mentality, or it's our ideas are somehow trying to defeat the bad ideas. It's not an us or them problem. It's a we problem. Discussing anti-Semitism, discussing Islamophobia is putting a mirror up to our own everyday lives and what we are guilty of doing. We're doing our best. We have to be thinking about it often. And one final point to that is that because Islamophobia and anti-Semitism play both a strong and soft part in our everyday lives, Jews and Muslims themselves sometimes promulgate these dangerous ideas and dangerous words about their own self-identity, living in negation, and sometimes starting to believe the various stereotypes that are pushed onto them. And that's dangerous. And that takes away someone's agency and safety. And if you go to our website, we had a lecture by Delia Mugahed, who shared her research about the Islamophobia Index, in that Muslims were guilty of being Islamophobic in this country. So when we say everyday anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia, we literally mean everyday language. And that's something that we'll explore. And so hopefully your question is, well, then how do we deal with it and how do we engage it? And thankfully, we're going to be doing a little bit of that tonight too.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, we are going to have, so we're going to spend, Ben, Hall, and I are going to spend about the next 30 minutes or so kind of doing a little presentation, talking through some of these things together. But as you have questions, we've built in some time for Q&A. So around 7:45, we're going to try to transition into some Q&A. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. You can send them to all the hosts or just directly to me, and I'll try to pose as many of those as we have time for. And then we're going to transition after that Q&A time into some breakout rooms where some of our ICJS staff will be facilitating, and we're going to work on some case studies, looking at some actual incidents of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that occur in our everyday lives. And you're going to have a chance to workshop and think through how would you address and speak to these things. So part of our hope tonight is to recognize that, because, as Ben was saying, these things are baked into our society, baked into our vocabulary, we're trying to find ways to surface them, to identify instances of everyday anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and then to address them in gracious and thoughtful ways. So sometimes when we see anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the world, it is so overt and it is so destructive that we have to just denounce it, right? So if you're seeing white supremacist protesters marching through the streets of Charlottesville, carrying tiki torches and shouting, "Jews will not replace us," that's not exactly a moment for dialogue. Right? That just requires denunciation. That just requires everyone in society to come together and say, that is wrong, right? But part of what we're exploring tonight is sometimes these incidents, these like subtle occurrences of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism occur in the actual relationships that we have. And we become aware of them as we do interreligious dialogue. We become aware of them as we engage in conversation and relationship across religious lines. We become aware of our own prejudices, our own biases, the ideas that we've maybe been carrying around that we weren't even aware that we were carrying around. And then we have the opportunity to face them and to address those things. So part of our hope tonight is that the conversations that we have, the examples that we use, would provoke all of us to new levels of self-reflection, would provoke all of us to want to engage more interreligiously and talk about these things interreligiously and make that something that is safe and acceptable in our interreligious dialogues. As we become aware of our own Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, as we become aware of others' Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, that is hopefully not an opportunity for posturing and so-called calling out all the time. And again, there is a space for that. There's a space for denunciation and calling out. But hopefully where we are in relationship or where we have opportunity to discuss with people, we can use that as an opportunity to educate in a kind of humble posture, to identify what is going on, and to graciously and thoughtfully dialogue with people and help them kind of enter that same process that we're in. So my question for Halla then is, how do we identify these sorts of things? How do we recognize and clue ourselves into these realities of everyday anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the day-to-day warp and woof of our lives?
So it's very, very difficult to recognize it because, as we are emphasizing, it's so part of our cultural script. it's normal, that we often don't. So one way or one step is really to recognize the complex identities and the complex contexts, right, in which anti-Semitism and Islamophobia occur. So taking myself for example, I am Muslim. I don't think about Islam in my daily life. I don't wear the hijab. I don't necessarily present as a Muslim to all people, depending on who I am talking to. I identify as a person of color, a woman. I grew up in the Middle East. I am not American. But I'm also married to a white American who grew up Jewish, and we're raising our kid kind of somewhere in between both traditions. So these are just examples of the intersecting identities that are part of who I am. They are also part of how the world reads me, and which aspects, at what point. It depends. So for instance, if I am with Mike, I may benefit from some of his whiteness. I am just another American. But if I'm with some of my Muslim friends or relatives from the Middle East, I'm definitely treated differently, talked to differently. One example that I would like to share, if I may, was the first time my partner Mike and I had traveled together to Turkey. We had a great time. We were there for 2 weeks, and then we came back. And my partner was all happy to be back in the US. It's so good to be back home. And I was happy to be back home as well. But I told him right before going through customs, you haven't been through customs with me yet. It's going to be a very different kind of welcome home. And lo and behold, we were there for 3 hours, being questioned about my name, my parents, who are your siblings, what mosque you belong to, which I don't. So we were there forever. But with that said, I know that if I were wearing a hijab, if Mike were an Arab man with a beard or Southeast Asian, a person of color, we would have been treated even worse. And then one more thing I wanted to point out is oftentimes these uncomfortable interactions happen with close friends, neighbors, relatives, as we've all been emphasizing, who are liberal and progressive, but, are still kind of, in a way to demonstrate their, a wokeness, which I appreciate, will still inadvertently make comments. I've talked about Mike. So for instance, how do your parents feel about having a Jewish son-in-law? That must be hard. So, all of which is to say, it's very, very difficult to recognize, given the different context and different identities. So it seems to me that one step is to recognize your position vis-a-vis all these other mixtures of identities and things that are going on as a starting point.
Yeah, and I appreciate the nuance that Halla is bringing there, because, right, these things occur differently depending on the relationships that we have with the people who are perpetrating them, right? Sometimes it's strangers, sometimes it's friends, sometimes it's a person that we know only slightly, sometimes it's family, right? And we're going to respond differently in each of those situations. So I'm going to pose a few questions, and I'll just throw them out there, and whichever of us feel like we've got some ideas or some response, we can just jump in. So how is it different being me versus being you, right? So I'm a Christian. I might observe anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but I'm not a victim of it. It isn't perpetrated. Those biases are not perpetrated against me. How is it different being in the position of the observer versus being the recipient of some of these comments? And what's the responsibility of somebody who's in the role that I am, hopefully somebody who's an ally against these things, but is witnessing them as opposed to receiving them directly?
I can start first. In that, while we do have differences in that I'm Jewish and that you're Christian, we both identify as, well, I might identify more middle-aged than you, but middle-aged white men in this country. And often people's first impression of me is not Jewish. And so when I moved to Virginia to teach at Virginia Tech for 6 years, it was very surprising because I would hear more often than I really do care to remember a lot of anti-Semitic things that were being said in jest. It was the first time I heard the phrase "Jew me down" or "Jew him down." And while those things bothered me, what bothered me more is that when people discovered that I was Jewish, there was something, I became in some ways racialized in the sense that my identity used to be attached to an adjective, Jewish, with a number of other adjectives. But then, and I apologize for using the word, but it was an ontological change in that I became a Jew, that was first and foremost who I would be. And it was the interactions with me after that that changed, that were subtle. There was almost a feeling of betrayal with my interlocutors that somehow I should have said something sooner. And so I often wondered what my responsibility was. Do I say that I'm uncomfortable with the way I'm being treated with what we now might call microaggressions? The fact that you now ignore me, you're not friendly to me anymore, or in one case, you stop allowing your children to play with my children. Or do I, for the sake of safety and peace, just let it go? Because we probably weren't the best friends in the first place and just acquaintances. And so very often I tried more of a dialogical approach because it's a small town. And I would say that sometimes I really appreciated the encounter, and other times I felt very alienated by it. And so I found myself both in the role of advocate and victim simultaneously. But what was interesting to me is a certain privilege that I got to inhabit in our society when I had lived in Chicago was taken away from me in a way that made me more cognizant that I had it in the first place, and made me more cognizant of maybe the mistakes that I had made up until that point, and sort of things that I assumed about my interlocutors when I engaged them. But at the same time, it made me start to question how I present outwardly to others. Do I even have a right to feel so comfortable about who I am? Should I be putting more protective layers? And it was, and still, and remains a complicated endeavor, especially as a resident in Baltimore City.
Okay. I think this is such a great question. It's a very complicated question, and it brings up a lot of other questions. I think, for example, it brings up this idea of whose responsibility is it to speak out, right? Is it the insider victim, or is it the outsider ally or advocate? And I think you can come about this in a number of ways, because you can certainly argue that, it's not the minority's responsibility to consistently be absolving everyone of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. And then the other thing that comes to mind too, and I think this is really important here, and this connects to sort of my points earlier on intersectionality, is who's more believable and why, and in which contexts, right? My guess is, in the society that we live in, white male Christian is probably more believable, especially if you're speaking for someone else. And then I can say from personal experiences, if I were to push back gently or to share an account where I felt like I was treated unfairly, I usually get the response of, well, you misread that. And that happens quite a lot in areas where, to my mind, is quite objective. So again, I think there are two things that we're touching upon here: the insider, outsider, whose responsibility, how can, victims and allies work together, and which voices are more authoritative or believable and why.
And as we've been saying, oftentimes these things are subtle. And I will just say, as somebody who is still learning, right, as an expert in interreligious and interfaith dialogue, who is still sometimes learning. Sometimes I don't notice, right? Yeah. It doesn't occur to me. So if I was in the situation of knowing Ben as he's living in kind of Southwest Virginia, well, Ben, sometimes people just don't like other people. How do you know it's because you're Jewish, right? And I think part of what we Christians who are wanting to grapple with these things is, I think we need to listen to our Jewish and Muslim friends and neighbors when they're identifying these things for us, and become sensitized to it, because sometimes it's not going to occur to us because we will want to grasp for other explanations of them. Are we always obligated, even if it's a comment that some random stranger makes, or even if it's something extremely subtle and hard to tease out and we don't have time, are we always obligated to respond to instances of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism? And if we aren't always obligated, when might it be okay to just let something go?
I can go first.
Yeah, please do.
I'll go first. So for years, I taught a Holocaust course at Virginia Tech, and I've taught similar variations of it in other places where we read Primo Levi. And one of the issues, almost every time I taught it, students would come to the point where Primo Levi is talking about being in the concentration camp, and it's always dark. You notice it was raining or snowing, but one day the sun came out, and for a moment, it was a beautiful day. And at that moment, he felt hungry. And that always struck my students of, well, when does it end? The issue is that it doesn't, and it's always a work in process. I think that if you regret not doing something, there is an urgency and an impulse in your desire to make change, to do so more so the next time. It's becoming cognizant of it and making mistakes and interacting with it that gives you more confidence over time to address it. I would say that at a certain point, and this goes back to Halla's point earlier in terms of believability and authority, we should be saying something. And the way that I tend to address it in my everyday life is to ask questions first. So rather than say, what I just heard was Islamophobic, I asked the person to repeat what they said and then repeat it back to them with a clarifying question. Did you mean to say it this way? Sometimes they say yes, but sometimes they also say no, because as they repeat it, they say, oh, wait, no, I didn't mean to say that. And so there's a dialogical moment in which a potential mismeeting could have happened where we misunderstood each other. But when the person says, well, yeah, and insert whatever prejudice you want there, and we're going to explore some of those in a few minutes, then you do say something. It doesn't have to be as provocative or as assertive, but say, have you ever wondered why that might be problematic or prejudicial or even promoting some form of violence? You know, most of the time people will not respond positively to it, but you've done your work. And no one said that this would be easy. If I could throw in just a quick, because I'm the Jewish scholar here, The word for work in Hebrew is avodah, but it also means worship. It also means service. They're all inexorably related to one another. In doing the work of fighting injustice and fighting prejudice and fighting racism, it is also a form of worship. It's also a relationship to something above and beyond as much as it is horizontally. And so in that moment, you have a responsibility, not just to that person, but also to the ineffable. It's a lot of power, but you should probably not let it go.
Yeah, I'm going to second that. I mean, I think that we do have an obligation. I think it's definitely important, and I think we're getting to a point where that's becoming more and more obvious that it's important to say something. But I really appreciated what you're saying, Ben, about how to approach it, right? By asking questions, not necessarily by like just coming out and saying, hey, that's Islamophobic or anti-Semitic, but asking questions. And so I guess my thought here is, yes, we have an obligation, but that obligation may take different forms depending on the context, depending on who we're talking to and how, right? And again, everything is dictated by power dynamics. So, I mean, there are moments where it is really difficult to speak up. And I think by thinking about it later or feeling uncomfortable with it and then talking about it with others after the fact, even if it doesn't happen at that moment, I think is still working in a productive direction.
And I also want to add to your point, this is something that we struggle with at our institute too. When you engage that person in that moment, whether through questioning or calling out after questioning the improper, offensive, or potentially violent statement, you're showing them a sign of respect. Too often in our culture, we dehumanize by ignoring. Engaging is a form of respect, even in disagreeing, because you're giving that person a sense of humanity and that you're allowing that person to speak for her or himself, rather than shutting that person off, reading them however you feel like you want to read them, and deciding that they're not worth your time. And so there's also the element that by giving them that time, you're giving them the dignity and respect that both of you deserve.
So, recognizing that we have limited time, I'm gonna move us towards a little storytelling. So, Ben and Halla and I are going to do a little round robin, and we're going to share some instances where we have observed everyday anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and let's try to keep these as brief as possible so we can get through as many of them as we can, and we'll see how much time we have. I'll start, and I think the instance I want to highlight first is an instance of anti-Semitism that I think to a lot of people doesn't sound like anti-Semitism. It sounds like what we might call philo-Semitism, admiring or loving Jews. So I was it was actually at the ICJS building. There was a Muslim community leader who came to our facility and just kind of knocked on the door, and I was talking to him. And he was a local to Baltimore, and he made an observation. He said, I wish the Muslim community was more like the Jews in Baltimore, because the Jews really take care of their own. And they've built all these institutions to take care of their own. And I wish the Muslims were more like that. Right. And so there's an element of admiration. There's an element of kind of honoring or uplifting something that he says he's really admiring about the Jewish community. But at the same time, he is broadly stereotyping and making it sound as though the Jewish community and the Jewish people in Baltimore only think about other Jews, which is absolutely not true. So in that instance, I tried to kind of share with him a little bit like, well, it's actually a little more complicated than that. And there are internal tensions within the Jewish community, right? And I don't know that I did a perfect job, but I tried as much as possible to highlight, like, it's not, I understand why you would want to express that, but that's actually not the best way to frame it. Halla, I think, why don't you go to
Okay. I have also on anti-Semitism, one response that I will sometimes get by folks who do read me as Muslim is, well, you're a Muslim, so you must share my views, negative views on the Jews, whether it's stereotypes about the Jews controlling the media, or I've heard they are just really into money. And this is, I also get this from other academics. I had a professor once come up to me and say, the issue with our foreign affairs is that Jews in America cannot let go of Jerusalem. If that ended, we wouldn't have a problem. And so, I would call that a double stereotyping, right? So he's stereotyping, or they're stereotyping me as a Muslim, a Muslim, you're a Muslim, therefore you're anti-Semitic. And it's also perpetuating stereotypes about Jews and Judaism, both extremely harmful, both problematic. In the situation with the professor, I did say something and he got very, very uncomfortable, but I do get anti-Semitic remarks more often than,
So I'll share one brief anecdote, and this is one that I think people have had experienced many iterations of it. I was invited out to a dialogue out in Sedona in Arizona. And the first question that I was asked is, where are the Muslims condemning terrorism? How come we don't ever hear about Muslims condemning terrorism? And my response was to simply say, pull out your phone and ask Siri. And so I did it as an exercise. Let's see what the phone says. And the first thing that came up was the Marrakesh Declaration. And so we had a conversation about, well, why is it that you don't know these things? In fact, most Muslims do condemn it, and most acts of terrorism, what we call terrorism, are against Muslims, Muslims against Muslims. It's far more complicated than you're giving credit to it. And at the same time, why would you feel comfortable to ask that as a first question? What, of all the questions of wanting to get to know religious others, religious communities, what emboldened you to say something that you already now know is ignorant? And it's a way to help people understand that this is part of our culture. It's not just that it's not entirely a form of their own agency in asking that question. It's become commonplace, whether in our news, our cinema, television. It's not seen as a problematic question. And so I wanted to share that experience because I think a number of us have had it in many different ways.
Yeah, just riffing on a similar experience that I have fairly frequently. My area of expertise is Muslim Christian dialogue. So I do a lot of speaking in churches about Islam and about things that are going on within the American Muslim community, within the global Islamic tradition. And I frequently get people asking similar questions to what Ben is talking about. Like, well, what about shouldn't we empower the moderate Muslims? And my response is frequently, nobody talks about me being a moderate Christian. So even the frame of moderate Islam, moderate Muslim, implies a subtle form of Islamophobia that says something about Islam needs to be moderated for Muslims to be good. Nobody talks about something about Christianity needs to be moderated in order for Christians to be good, right? So it assumes there's some fundamental dysfunction or problem within Islam. Similarly, when I speak at churches, I frequently encounter Christians who have just enough education about Islam to be dangerous. And let me give you an example. So I often am speaking about kind of different dimensions within Islam. And I'll have people, I've had this happen multiple times. People will say, well, it's all the real problem is, that they closed the gates of ijtihad. and for those who don't know anything about kind of the Islamic tradition, the ijtihad is this idea with an Islamic jurisprudence about kind of the freedom of scholars to reason about new instances and kind of grapple with the tradition as a whole. It's a very kind of subtle thing. But these people have memorized a phrase that is a phrase that occurs in the Islamic tradition. But in saying that, they are saying the problem is that Muslims are inflexible and can't think outside their own boxes, right? And so they know a phrase, they've got something that they can say at cocktail parties, but they're using that phrase to then stereotype Muslims and say, oh, see, the Muslim mind is inflexible because I've got a phrase to explain that. And so I think even where you feel like you've done some good book reading, that when that runs up against reality, I think it can be very toxic.
All right. So thinking along with Matt's story, another thing that I wanted to talk about is internalized Islamophobia by Muslims, sort of this subtle form of Islamophobia of the good Muslim versus the bad Muslim also becomes internalized. And I can I'll admit in my younger days of, wanting to fit in, and I know so many other Muslims and Arab immigrants, in an effort to fit in and feel like you can be part of the conversation, you sometimes go along with certain stereotypes or things that are said, like, oh, you're not like those Muslims, you don't cover, or you may drink, or you're moderate, you're good. And then the other thing related to that, in my own experience, I noticed that a lot right after 9/11. Right? Because everybody was so scared about discrimination that there was sort of this desire to play into the stereotypes and shed one's Muslimness. And, this is problematic for a number of reasons that we don't have time to get into here. But one thing that I wanted to point out is it indicates that if you're Muslim and if you're religious at all, you're bad. And it also obscures the diversity of Muslim identities, practices. It's just, I find that to be an extremely problematic and an extremely harmful encounter and engagement.
I guess I'll share the last anecdote, and then we'll move to. Within a few weeks of moving to Virginia, and I know that I feel bad that Virginia's taking the brunt of my frustration tonight, but it happened, so there's not much I can do. When we first moved, I was the director of Jewish studies, and there were a number of Israeli families that lived in Blacksburg, and so they wanted to welcome us, and they came to our home. And there was a knock on the door, and there were two police officers, and they were responding to a noise complaint, and it was maybe 2 or 3 in the afternoon on a weekend. So I was a bit bemused as to why I was engaging 2 police officers at my door. I was a little uncomfortable because that had never happened to me. And they were talking about a noise complaint. And I didn't quite know what that meant. My children could be loud, but they were really young. So I was confused why we were having this interaction. They heard the Hebrew. And the one police officer said, is that Arabic? And I said, no, it's Hebrew. And he said, is that similar to Arabic? And one thing that Matt neglected to tell you at the beginning, my background's in language. I study the philosophy of language. I finally had an audience that I thought might be interested in the nuances between the 2 languages. They were not. And it became clear to me that someone had called the police because they heard Arabic or what they perceived to be Arabic. I asked the police officer if that was against the law. I'm new here. I'm uncomfortable with this. And he said, no, it's just, 9/11. Now, I want to give you some context to that. So it's Islamophobic for sure, but this is in the wake of, at the time, the largest mass shooting in history at the school. Within a few months, everybody's minds were able to return to the real threat, and that they were afraid of us more than anyone else, and that interaction was considered kosher or halal. So the reason why I put it out there is that while they were relieved in a really Islamophobic way to find out that I wasn't Muslim, my neighbors weren't, because it was for them not the news they wanted to hear, that I was Jewish. I don't know where on the hierarchy I fell, but that impacts you emotionally. And even though the interaction was fairly respectful and banal and simple, almost 15 years later, it still comes up every now and then.
So I'm going to transition us over to taking some questions from the audience. And again, if you as audience members have questions, please put those in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as we can here. So Alexandra has a really interesting question. She asks, where does one begin with friends and family who are members of Southern Baptist related churches and are clearly not aware of the politics being promoted in those churches, or not kind of cognizant of that? And how does one point out the role that these churches are playing in the division of society today? And maybe I'll hone that a little bit more to say there are particular communities where these stereotypes and these bigotries are being perpetuated. How do we talk to people about the communities they belong to, the churches that might be bringing these ideas to into their active consciousness? I guess as the Protestant scholar, I can jump in. I'll let Ben and Halla have a breathing second. I think this is a really important question. I think we have to recognize that while anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are endemic in American Christian communities, there are particular communities that are more aware and are more sensitive to those things and are trying to address them. As Halla was saying, I personally belong to a very progressive Protestant church, but I still hear people perpetrating very negative stereotypes about Jews and Judaism, especially when it comes to the ways that people talk about the New Testament, contrasting Jesus against his own people, right? Jesus is Jewish. But contrasting Jesus against his people, or saying that having Jesus kind of be this isolated person as opposed to somebody who is fully inhabiting first century Judaism and the first century Jewish tradition. I think we have to be very thoughtful, especially what I appreciate about this question is it's about family members and friends, right? It's one thing when we are encountering a stranger and they make a comment, because you can have even a knockdown, drag out argument and move on. With family members, right, we have to be thoughtful. So I think what Ben was highlighting as a strategy, kind of as you hear people expressing things, approaching it by asking questions, like, oh, well, where did you hear that? Well, what I hear when you say that is this. Is that how you understand it? Right. And so kind of having interrogative questions that are not aggressive, but that are kind of holding up a mirror and saying like this, oh, well, your pastor preached that, huh? Well, why do you think your pastor thinks that? Right. Oh, your Bible study leader said that about Jesus. Did you check that against anything else? Right. And I'll just one of my favorite recommendations for Christians, and especially around these questions of anti-Semitism, is go out and do it tonight. Go out and purchase the Jewish Annotated New Testament. The second edition is much better than the first edition. They added a lot in the second edition. It's on Amazon. It's on just about any bookseller. It's a New Testament that gives you commentary by Jewish scholars who are deeply immersed in the world of first century Judaism, but they're reading the New Testament as Jewish scholars and putting it into context of first century Judaism. I think it's an incredibly helpful resource for us Christians, and especially as you have particular questions coming up with your friends and family, you can go be like, let me go do my research on that passage and then come back to you and see what a different way of thinking about that might be. Okay, let me pose another question, unless Ben or Halla want to add anything on that one. Okay. So here's another question that we got. So I'm trying to find it in the chat here because I want to do justice to the question. So the question is about extremism, and that you have in all of our religious traditions, you have what some people would call fundamentalism or religious extremism. This is what makes the news. And this is what impacts how people form their opinions, right? Oftentimes what the news focuses on is the worst. And the most overt racist, the most overt anti-Semitism, the most overt Islamophobia, and then also the worst elements of each of our religious communities that we might not feel are representative of us. How do we grapple with that? And how do we think about that? Because oftentimes we're getting hit with kind of things that we don't identify with in our traditions.
If I may, I don't know, Islam often gets associated with such labels. I mean, we hear Islamic fundamentalists or Muslim extremists all the time. I mean, one thing that I usually, like to tell my students or think about is this idea that it's not unique to one group. Because I've found that, simply by stating these are fringe groups and this is what's going on, that's not quite enough. But when I generalize it, it seems to translate better. And this sort of, the other thing that I was thinking about, Matt, as you were talking about how to address our communities and our religious communities in particular, is language. Because we have a tendency to be way more nuanced when it comes to ourselves, right? We know there's violence in America. We know there are issues. So if you ask most people, America is fill in the blanks, we tend to be more nuanced when it comes to ourselves. So in the same way, I usually like to emphasize to students, I mean, can you say Muslims are, Judaism is, fill in the blanks? I mean, as soon as you put one label in there, it's definitely going to fall apart. But it's a very difficult subject.
For me, it definitely depends on the context. So my anxieties and frustrations come out when I'm in my own community, because my radar is finally attuned to my own extremism, and the things that I don't think it's fair necessarily to say that these views are unrepresentative of the tradition, but traditions are fragmented, traditions are complicated. The first rule of thumb in learning about anything that we call in the phenomenon of religion is that there is no such thing as that one thing, right? So all religions, or what we call religion, have tradition, they live in time, they live in context. Religion itself is not either violent or peaceful, people are. And so then religion becomes a tool to express that point of view. The extremism that I start to see play out in political contexts, what I like to help people do is show that the texts and the ideas that inform people's extremism are also the texts and ideas that inform people's peaceful activities, dialogical activities. It doesn't have to be that way, and that the work is internal, but it's external too, in that no one has a monopoly on extremism. No one has a monopoly on bigotry. And again, going back to the initial statement at the beginning, it's not an us or them problem. It's we, it's all of our problems. So for me to be the best Jewish person I can possibly be, I also want Hindus, Muslims, Christians, people who don't have any orientation to religion at all, to be the best versions of themselves without any sort of extreme tendencies. But what that requires is allowing the extremists to be called extremists. They're taking an extreme line. The problem itself is extremism. The problem is not Christianity or Judaism. To talk about Christianity in the United States, for me, as a non-Christian and a non-expert in Christianity is dizzying, because ultimately the word doesn't signify anything. It signifies what you need Christianity to be. And for some, they need it to be extremists so they can say all religion is X or Y. But most of us don't live in extremes. And so it's just helpful in certain contexts to allow us permission to live healthily and naturally and dialogically with religion.
We've got a couple minutes left. So I want to pose a question from Matt, because Matt has a great name, and also because Matt came up with a very good question. So this question is, when addressing these issues in our workplaces or with students, how do you balance knowledge and awareness building of religious traditions and practices with skill building and empowerment to act? Or he gives an alternate way of phrasing this. How can we encourage action when our students perceive their own lack of knowledge as what is Islamophobic or anti-Semitic? So how much is it about building up literacy about these traditions as compared with building up skill sets to address Islamophobia? How, right? There's that tension of how do you know what is Islamophobic and anti-Semitic if you don't understand some things about Islam and Judaism? But then again, you can't know everything about these traditions. So how much should we focus on skill building?
Can I take a shot real quickly at answering it? Am I going out of order?
No, go ahead.
So I think that's a fantastic question, because there's this impulse right now for people to write definitions of anti-Semitism so that you can click checks on the box to say, well, that was anti-Semitic. Most things in life sort of exist without those definitions in place. If it's a problem that all of us have and that all of us are in some way complicit in, a tool would be how to best ask the right questions. And I know that I am belaboring this point, but it's how you're getting the best out of your interlocutor. I'm not entirely sanguine about the approach, but it's how to ask the right questions, how to build confidence to engage someone in such a way to say, how do you know what you said you know? And it comes on your intuitions. Right? So maybe you don't know that it's anti-Semitic. Maybe you don't know that it's Islamophobic. You just heard it. It doesn't sit right, or it sits perfectly fine. You just have to ask the question to interrogate the idea. So you better understand what you're both engaging in. And I think empowering people to feel comfortable asking those questions, because they're not always comfortable questions to ask. So what I find in terms of a good tool is repeating what I heard back in the question, and sometimes sharing what I think I heard that statement be, how I received it. So if you say something Islamophobic and I come back to you and say, well, this is how it landed on me, and the bottom line is it sounds prejudiced. Can you correct me? Can you tell me what I misunderstood about your statement? Because I want to make sure I understand you properly. Now, in contexts, and these are the contexts that are going to happen more often. And also going back to the even previous point, when do you know to do it and when do you not know to do it? My impulse is just to lean in and do it. You know your schedule. You know whether or not you need to get to the meeting. Maybe hold it and come back to it. But you're doing yourself and that other person a service. It's by addressing it at some point. And I really think giving someone a chance to explain themselves without judgment, you can get a clear indication of where you both need to go in that conversation.
All right. It's 8:01. Ben and Hall and I have been talking for an hour. Now it's your turn. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into breakout rooms. And we'll have facilitators in those breakout rooms who are going to kind of help guide you through this next exercise. But we're going to spend about 25 minutes in breakout rooms, and we're going to offer you two scenarios. So we told some stories about everyday occurrences. We're going to give you two scenarios, one that focuses on Islamophobia, one that focuses on anti-Semitism. And we want you to workshop these a little bit. So as you get into your breakout rooms, your facilitators will have you introduce yourselves. Maybe you kind of share one thing you're learning or taking away from this first hour. But then we're going to transition into working on these scenarios and really kind of role playing this a little bit. And how would you tackle a thorny and subtle, maybe not so subtle in some cases, instance. So I'm going to have Ben and Halla read our two case studies, our two scenarios, and then we're going to send you into breakout rooms, and you'll work on these in the breakout rooms. So Ben, do you want to go ahead and read the Islamophobia scenario?
Sorry. Yes. So you and a group of coworkers are having a lunchtime discussion at the office. The topic of the burkini, a full body covering swimsuit that some Muslim women prefer to wear to preserve their modesty, has been coming up a lot in the news. And some politicians in France want to ban women from wearing it. One of your coworkers, a progressive woman who identifies as a feminist, says, "Isn't the burkini just another example of the Islamic oppression of women in our culture? Why can't women just be free to be who they are on public beaches?" Another of your coworkers, an older man, chimes in. "Yeah, Muslim women should wear normal beach clothing. There's nothing wrong with just a normal swimsuit. Those can be plenty modest."
Okay. So that's scenario one, an office conversation about the burkini. And in both these scenarios, we want you to assume you are who you are, right? So don't try to take on some other identity. You are who you are in this situation. You've just heard your coworkers make this comment. How are you going to react? All right. And Halla, why don't you read the second case study that we have?
Okay. Your large extended family has some religious diversity. There are Muslims, Jews, Christians, Buddhists, and nuns. People who don't identify with any religious tradition. Among your immediate family, cousins, aunts, uncles, etc., you are at a big family gathering to watch the Super Bowl. A group of family members are marveling during a commercial break at how expensive Super Bowl ads are this year. And your cousin, who everyone knows likes to do provocative things, says loudly enough so everyone can hear, "We all know the Jews control the media, so they must be making a fortune today."
Right. So again, assuming you are who you are, how would you go about addressing this situation? And your facilitators will have these as well. So they can, if you have questions about them, they can answer them. All right. Well, let's go to breakout rooms and we'll come back and have a few minutes at the very end to wrap up. All right, we are back. Maybe somebody could pull Halla up on the spotlight here as well. I'm not seeing her immediately. And Ben's cat has joined us. Welcome to Ben's cat. So as hopefully that was a helpful exercise. Hopefully you got a chance to play with these ideas and these complexities in the real world, or at least our sketch of the real world a little bit. I'm going to just open it up for Ben or Halla if they have any kind of concluding thoughts, any last comments before we wrap up for the evening.
I guess I'll start. This was really great. We had a wonderful conversation in our breakout group. I think one of the things that I found myself thinking throughout today is this idea of being comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think the point is not to be in the know, and to always question and not take your knowledge for granted, and to always, just be listening more than making statements. That is my simple conclusion.
Yeah, I think that sometimes we don't want to engage because we feel like we don't know enough to engage. And we're really here to tell you tonight that you have enough tools. One need not be an expert on Islam, Judaism, the history of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia to say that just doesn't sound right. Could you clarify that for me? Let's broach this with shared ignorance. That sounds an awful lot lot like a stereotype, right? And it sounds simple on Zoom. It sounds simple when I say it, but we know in that moment, it's very difficult. But more than just being a moral imperative, I would say, and this is sort of the theologian in me speaking, you're doing the work of repair when you do that, because you're giving that person an opportunity to change and some dignity in respecting that person's orientation to the world at that moment. And when you hold that truth in that moment, it should give you some confidence. And I did say in my group, I have not mastered the art of questioning. Many times it doesn't go the way I imagined it or wanted to do it, but it's essential. We don't want to let these things slip by.
Yeah, and a lot of our goal tonight has not been to provide you with scripts or easy solutions or simple answers, because none of this stuff is easy. None of this stuff is simple. Obviously, we all exist within webs of very complex relationships. And these things, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, they are embedded within our culture, as we've been saying. So thank you for having the courage to come out tonight, to even try to work on these questions. And we at ICJS, we care deeply about these questions. We want to keep learning with you. So keep coming back, keep talking to us. If you have scenarios where you're like, gosh, I think I could have done this a little better, and you want to talk it through with people, that's what we're here for. We're trying to find ways to dismantle these things productively and helpfully and relationally and dialogically. So thank you again for coming tonight. We have all kinds of events coming up. Ben is going to be doing an event next month on holy envy, and talking with a book author who's just written on Jewish Christian relations and some of the dimensions of holy envy that occur between Jews and Christians right now. And we have another course coming up in May on Messianic Judaism and Christian Zionism and what they look like in America today. So we've got a lot of things still going on. Keep watching and looking at our website, www.icjs.org. And sign up for other events. And as always, we just would remind everyone that we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We do these types of events have them be free to the public, but we also exist because we have donors and supporters who believe in what we do. And so you can donate through our website, and there's all kinds of other ways to support the work that we do as well, even just by coming and attending. So spread the word. Thank you again for being with us tonight, and we will see you next time.